Hello, this is lecture 6 of our series on deciphering the Indus script, and in this lesson we're going to show how we can use evidence from what we're calling the M fields for what I'm referring to as an entering wedge for decipherment. So before we start into that subject proper, just a very quick review of what we talked about in lecture 5 and some of the previous lectures. Get her going here, there we go. So again, with the Indus inscriptions, we have both notational and transcriptive types of writing mixed together, particularly with the so-called patterned inscriptions. We see this a lot. And so with patterned inscriptions, we have notational writing in the M fields and T fields, and we're going to focus on the M fields. Whereas the transcriptive writing, which is kind of the goal of the decipherment, because that's the writing that's actually going to be representations of things like names and titles and things like that. It's going to actually represent language in the usual sense that we understand it. That's going to be found in the P fields, the C fields, and in complex inscriptions. So we'll be seeing a lot of examples of these types of writings going forward. So just bear that in mind. We're going to focus in this lesson on the M fields that we've already identified as probably being metrological in content, specifically dealing with weights, because weights are the kinds of things that were used once upon a time as money to denote assets and transactions and things of this nature. And we're going to see whether we can leverage any facts from these M fields, any facts to obtain hypothetical sign values. All right. So another part of the review is the canonical structure of the M field, which, as we've already shown, is kind of broken into 3 parts. Now, these 3 parts are not always present in all M fields, but they consist of up to 2 non-repeating members of a set of 3 signs that we call the O subfield for oval, because these 3 signs up here, this one's the least common, but there's also this one and this one are very common, and they all share an oval grapheme of some sort, and in the case of at least these latter 2, appear to be compounds involving the oval sign and perhaps some other sign like the staff sign, and in this case the tongs sign, of which we'll have much more to say later on. Then there's the F subfield, which is probably the most recognizable, because many investigators of the script have looked at the F subfield. F for fish, because it consists of up to 3 non-repeating members of a set of a total of 7 different signs, which have in common a shared fish-like grapheme, including a sign that is in fact the fish grapheme unto itself. And then the others appear to be variations on that, including 2 which we see actually graphologically consist of 2 separate signs side by side. All right, and then finally this invariant pair that looks like going right to left. I mean, this would be the first sign here, the one that looks like a vessel of some sort with a stick stuck down in the middle, and left adjacent or following that 3 vertical strokes. So when all 3 are present, they almost invariably follow the order. Or again, remember the direction of writing is right to left. So O subfield is first, then F subfield, and then this invariant pair. And you can see a few examples, just to refresh your memory, underlined in red, of M fields in some patterned inscriptions. So here we have, in this one, we see only the first 2 fields. Here's the oval sign, and here are 2 fish signs. Here's one that has 2 oval signs followed by 2 fish signs right there, right? Okay. Here's a full M field. It has 2 oval signs, 1 fish sign, and then the invariant pair at the last. Here's one with 2 oval signs, a single fish sign. Here's another. These last 2 are examples of full M fields. So again, 2 oval signs in this one, 1 fish sign, the invariant pair. Here's 1 oval sign, then 2 fish signs, then the invariant pair, and so forth. Okay, so that I think is it. Well, then finally, we just mentioned once again, and we used this slide earlier, but to refresh your memory, the rationale for claiming that M fields are most likely metrological and represent notations of assets or transactions, which means in effect that they're going to probably represent weights. Okay, more specifically, because weights were what were used to represent transactions before coinage was introduced. And certainly in the Bronze Age, there was no coinage in the sense that we understand it. Now, we also eliminated other possibilities of notational writing, calendrics, because there's not enough regularity we would expect to see some sort of standardized template for day, week, month, year, or something similar, but M fields don't always display a full range of allowable subfields. They're too varied to represent, calendar dates. All right. Then we have addresses, but there are no candidates for toponyms or individuated locales, and similar patterns are found on artifacts from many different sites, many of them hundreds and hundreds of miles apart. So there's really no evidence that these constitute addresses either. Finally, titles, personal titles. This is one that's been suggested by at least one prominent investigator. I don't know if he still has that opinion or not, but it was more than 30 years ago that Osco Parpola suggested that the fish signs, at least, might correspond to certain titles, that kind of thing, maybe theonyms. But there are far too many permutations. I mean, there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different varieties of just configurations of fish signs, let alone fish signs in combination with oval signs and so forth. So the great variety. And finally, numerals is tempting. There's clearly a numerical aspect to these signs, as we've shown. The fish sign for one and the staff sign for another are often shown in association with stroke numerals, but they themselves don't appear to be numerals, but something that use numerals, or numeral-like. And so again, the inference is that these are probably being notations of assets or transactions of some sort, are probably ultimately indicative of weights or series of weights. All right. Now another reminder is that these are the two varieties, the two chief allographs of what we're calling the staff sign, because it looks a bit like a staff of grain or a blade of grass or some such. And you can see that it occurs very frequently in inscriptions unto itself with nothing but a stroke numeral of various lengths. I mean, so we've got 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, and there are actually others, 9 and 12 and so forth, that are also found. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and these inscriptions are often found on seals with field animals, in the same way that other inscriptions are. And so people who would look at these and say, well, that must be the name of a god, or this must be a votive prayer, it just doesn't make sense looking at them. Clearly these inscriptions are some sort of compact notation of some kind, and so they alone, I think, constitute necessary and sufficient evidence that indeed, pacey the objections of some people that I've heard over the years, that these seals do in fact sometimes have this type of information on them. All right, so let's start with a series of questions that we're going to answer. And let's start with the staff sign. Is there any attested language in South Asia in which a unit of measurement is somehow related to the idea of a staff of grain, of grass, of straw, etc.? Now this is based on the graphology of the staff sign, as well as the fact that we've already said, by virtue of its distributional properties, that it probably denotes a unit of weight of some kind. So we're using the graphology here in conjunction with its distributional properties. And if you recollect back to the lecture where I talked about what doesn't work in decipherment versus what may work, one of the things that may work is by combining clues of graphology with distributional clues. And this is something that no one else seems to be willing to do. People want to jump straight to the graphology and say, well, this sign looks like this, and that sign looks like that, and just assign values to it on that basis. So I don't want you to confuse this method with that. All right? There is an answer to this question, and it's an intriguing one. One of the most important of all units of weight in Sanskrit is the pala. Notice it's a short pala, whose other meaning in Sanskrit is straw. And for those of you who are familiar with Romance languages, it's cognate with the Latin word paleus, whence Spanish paja, French paille, etc. So this is a word that goes back to early Indo-European, and it's found in Sanskrit. So it has this double meaning. So on the one hand, it was used as a unit of measure, the pala, and on the other hand, it denoted a straw, a piece of straw. And so here we have a sign that looks, for all the world, like a piece of straw or a blade of grass or a staff of grain, and it's also behaving like a unit of weight. And so we set this forth hypothetically as the first of a whole series of interesting coincidences. So for now, we're going to say hypothetically, this might be an interesting value for this sign to have. We're going to have more to say about this sign in the next slide. All right. So our next slide, we have another problem with this sign. So if this sign, if these two allographs of this sign corresponds to the unit of weight pala, then why is this sign also found in complex inscriptions? Okay, so this is another significant distributional trait of this sign. It's also found in P fields and C fields, and we've seen this already. So for example, this inscription here, you may recollect, is actually a very common repetitive inscription, and it's found, this is basically a C field. All right, and this one is as well. And so here's another version of it. And here it is in a somewhat longer, embedded in a longer inscription, clearly not in an M field. And the same is true here and these other examples. So this sign seems to do double duty in some sense. It's occurring in other sign fields. Now, this one's particularly interesting here. Here we have it in this example, MH9091. It's occurring in what seems to be an M field, where you have 4 stroke numerals, and there it is right there. And that looks good. But then you have the juncture sign here, and then you have a P field in front of that, and it's occurring as the final sign in that P field, likewise here. Okay, and so this is an interesting thing. So this suggests that it has a second value consistent with use in transcriptive text, because these now are not notational fields. These are transcriptive fields. So presumably they have nouns, either proper names of people or titles, or perhaps names of places, or something, or perhaps even goods for transaction. But these are full words, and this sign is also found there. So perhaps it has a second value consistent with it. Well, let's talk about that for a little bit. Okay. So the hypothesis that suggests itself, and I should say before I read this whole thing that this took me many years to figure out. I kind of hit more than 20 years ago on the possibility that the staff sign might correspond to the weight, the pala. But I was absolutely baffled as to why that sign also shows up in clearly a non-metrological context. And for a while, my thinking was maybe it's all metrology. Maybe all those things are other types of names of grains, and it's some sort of a determiner sign or something marking. I didn't know what to make of it. But finally, it occurred to me what this might mean. Because you see, there's another word in Sanskrit that sounds very much like pala, except that the a is long, pala. See that? And it's not a unit of weight, but pala is a very common word meaning guard or protector or keeper. You can see here in the text, and it's a very common final element in names and titles. For example, bhupala, which means king or prince, and it literally means earth protector. The form bhu means earth, right? And dhanapala, which means treasurer. Literally money protector. But others like Ashvapala means horse protector or horse groom, and Gopala means cow protector or cow herd. And that's in fact, Gopala is the term that's used for Krishna in one of his avatars, where he appears as someone who guards the cows. And the name Gopal is found in India to this day. So in modern India, the Pala part is just shortened to Pal typically, but there are a number of names that end with this. So I thought, well, okay, here's an interesting secondary hypothesis. Maybe this sign also stands for Pala, and when it's occurring in C fields and P fields and in complex inscriptions, maybe it represents that. And it's basically names that end in pala. So again, another interesting, suggestive, distributional trait of this sign that seems to square with at least a hypothetical possibility for a value. Okay, so let's turn to another interesting sign pair, and this is this invariant pair that we've seen. So I haven't had much to say about it. This pair of signs right here. Okay, now almost all of the time when it occurs in an M field, which is very frequently, and you can see a bunch of examples here on this slide, it is the final element, the leftmost or final element. Okay, so it almost looks like it's a comment on what goes before. And so we have another interesting question for which begs of an answer. Is there any attested word in any South Asian language that is likely to characteristically appear at the end of a notation of assets or mensuration, kind of an invariant term? And there is another answer, and it's a very suggestive one, as we shall see. The very common Sanskrit word matra, measure or amount, or exactly or in the amount of, is very frequently found as a bound postposition after numerals and measures, with the meaning exactly or in the amount of or equal to, such as krosha matre, at the distance of a kos, that was an ancient measurement of distance, masa matre, in a month or exactly a month, shata matram, 100 in number, and so forth and so on. Okay, this word, by the way, matra or matram, technically it's a neuter word, is cognate with the Latin word meter, which of course is where we get the word meter and metric and metrical, and also more indirectly via French, measure and measurement. These are all cognate words. This is another hoary old Proto-Indo-European word that's come down to us via Latin and Sanskrit, and I believe in some other Indo-European languages as well. So this is interesting, but there's more of interest. And that is, here's a secondary question, is there anything about the appearance of the sign pair, this sign pair here, right, that's suggestive of the term matra? Well, there kind of is, because if we assume that each of the two signs corresponds to a single syllable, then we end up with the likelihood that this one corresponds to ma, and the three vertical strokes corresponds to tra. And the interesting thing about that is that tra in Sanskrit happens to be one of the two roots that means three, the number three. So we have another interesting hypothesis, namely that this triple stroke sign that looks, iconically very much like the number three, the numeral three, might be so devised because it denotes this, what I call an implementive suffix. Tra is actually a very common suffix in Sanskrit. It's found in words like patra, which means vessel, and mitra, which means friend, and kshetra, which means field, and many, many other words. There are hundreds of words that end it. It's a very productive affix, derivational affix in Sanskrit. And we don't have time to show this with this presentation, but if you take the time to go through the Mahadevan Concordance or the ICIT and look at all the occurrences of this sign, you will see that in addition to its occurring here as the final element in this pair, it also occurs as the final element in various other words, and I do mention this in my fuller monograph, which lends additional credence to the idea that this sign here corresponds to some sort of affix-like sign, which tra is. Tra is a very productive affix in Sanskrit. Then I would also add, and I discussed this at some length in the monograph, that a ma is a very common syllable, and you would expect it to be fair, one of the commoner signs across languages. I mean, typologically, there is no language in the world that doesn't have the sound ma, and most of them use it in the word for mother too, which is something that Roman Jakobson wrote a famous paper about many years ago. Why mama and papa? So, but in any case, and the interesting thing about this sign here is that it behaves like a syllable sign and not like a lexeme sign, not like a logograph, because you never find this sign occurring by itself, or by itself followed by a juncture sign, or by itself followed by a T sign like the jar sign. It always occurs minimally with at least one other sign in a word unit. And also, it's of all the signs in the Harappan signary, it is one of the ones with the most random of distributions. So, before I ever hit upon this hypothesis, this sign was on my short list of signs that are likely to correspond to a common CV syllable. So ma would be a perfectly reasonable expectation. All right. So now here's another thing that we want to point out. And we need to start, we need a little homework here first. This Bowman sign that we've already seen a few times seems that there's also a sign that just looks like a bow and arrow that doesn't have the anthropomorph ligature to it. There are a number of signs in the Harappan signary that look like another sign with this like stick figure or anthropomorph ligatured to it. Again, in my actual monograph, I talk about these signs as well. And quite a number of them show the distributional pattern that I'm about to show for these two, namely that they broadly overlap. So you'll see from what I have tabulated here, some evidence that these two signs, that their shared graphology is not coincidental, that in fact these two signs probably have the same or nearly the same pronunciation, because occasionally you see them switched out, essentially in the same way. So you see it here. Both of them occur left adjacent to this interesting sign pairing, which you may remember from an earlier presentation. We hypothesized that this double bar sign might be a prefix of some kind. Anyway, we'll have more to say about that later on. But you can see a bunch of examples of that here. And then over here, we see the same thing with this bar that looks like a square with a stick coming out the top. We find instances of both. So the data suggests that they have approximately the same sound, and presumably that sound is represented by the bow grapheme, whatever that is. The stick figure has some sort of modifying sense, or in terms of the meaning. It's not entirely clear. I do have a theory about that, a hypothesis, but it's not mature enough to warrant inclusion in this presentation or in the monograph. But in any case, the point being is that these two signs probably correspond to nearly the same sound, and that sound may well have something to do with a bow or a bow and arrow. I mean, the graphology is pretty unmistakable in this case. But again, we have to look at the distribution. And there's a really interesting distribution trait of these two signs, and that is that they occur in, well, the bowman sign in particular. There's one instance with the bow sign as well, occurring in a similar context. But the bowman sign occurs occasionally, as we did note earlier on, if you were paying close attention in an earlier lecture, sometimes occurs in these funny notations with this little U sign and stroke numerals and stuff like that, which we've suggested are some other kind of asset notation. Usually these lines occur on a separate face or separate side of the inscribed object and seem to denote something like they've been scratched on later. They're not necessarily carved in relief the way these are. They seem to record some sort of a transaction. And we will have some more to say about this toward the end of this series of lectures. But for now, suffice it to say that, again, with this bowman sign, and by extension the bow sign per se, seems to have some relation to metrology or asset notations. So we have another question. Is there any attested language in South Asia in which a word for bow is similar to a word having to do with metrology or assets? In other words, is there a language in which the word for bow could plausibly have rebus value in such contexts? And yet again, there's an answer, and yet again, it comes from a Sanskritic source, because one of the two major words for Sanskrit for bow is dhanu, the other one being chapa. Okay, but this is dhanu. And the Sanskrit word for property or money or wealth is dhana, so they're almost the same word. So if we posit a value of dhan or dhana or something similar for the bowman, that would make sense in an Indo-Aryan and a Sanskritic context, given the graphology and, again, the distribution of this sign, all right, dhan or dhana. So notice that we now have three interesting potential clues that we've extracted from examining the signs in these M fields. Okay, the first one, and probably the most important one, as things have turned out, is the sign that we hypothesize might represent pala and pala. Okay, and we've arrived at that conclusion because of its appearance as well as its distribution. All right, and then we found this matra. Again, its distribution and its appearance are strongly suggestive of what I call a pleonastic number measure, which is a fancy way of saying a sign that refers pleonastically or redundantly, if you will, to numbers or measurements. And then the third now is this bowman sign, which we've assigned, again, because of its distribution and graphology, suggested that it might just possibly have this value. Certainly, Indo-Aryan / Sanskrit is very accommodating in this respect, but right now this is still all hypothesis. But I would note from the previous lecture that we've also found at least three typological features of this language, namely that it seems to have formed noun compounds, that it seems to have formed geminate compounds, and that it seems to have prepositions, all of which correspond to Indo-Aryan as well as Indo-European, early Indo-European languages generally, and none of which are found in Dravidian, at least in the form that we see it. So, while we're still very much in the hypothetical stage of our decipherment, the evidence is starting to point in a particular direction. And here's a summary of what we have so far. If we're correct, we have, well, I say here 4 signs. It's actually 5 signs because I forgot to include in this table alongside the Bowman sign the bow sign. We're basically saying both of them have a value probably similar to dun or dunna or something like that. Now, notice something that we've learned. If we're correct about the nature of the staff sign, if it does indeed correspond to pala and pala, then we've learned something important about the script. And moreover, something that's not terribly surprising, given that the script dates from the Bronze Age, long before the invention of modern alphabets and the other sophisticated writing systems like the Devanagari script that we have now. And that is that this writing system probably did not differentiate between long and short vowels. So as a result, we can infer that if we're correct in identifying this sign as ma with a long a, it may also represent ma, short a. And likewise, this one may represent both tra and tra. It's impossible to say. All right. And we've also seen that signs may now have the form, if we're correct, may have the form CV. Here's an example of a CV sign, consonant vowel, which is what you would expect. I mean, all known logographic writing systems have CV signs in them, and also CV-CV. So we have CV-CV with pala and also with dana or dun or dunna. Okay. This one, by the way, we could add is CCV. So that's a possibility as well. In any case, this is our hypothesis. What can we do with it? Well, we have a testable methodology now. We can use these signs as what I call anchor values in conjunction with substring searchable online databases to try to ascertain other sign values. Bearing in mind, of course, that some signs will represent simple CV and other basic syllable types, while others will represent full words, lexemes, okay, or word roots, and still others will be compound signs, okay? But the main takeaway here is that with the advent of substring searchable online databases in the last 15, 20 years, this method has become possible. Now, when I first began working on the Indus script back in the early 1990s, this kind of thing didn't exist. There were no online searchable databases. And under those conditions, decipherment, such as I'm proposing, would have been impossible unless you had an eidetic memory and could literally go through and memorize every single Sanskrit word in every existing dictionary and lexicon, not just the Monier-Williams dictionary, but all the others. There's several other major, there's a Sanskritisches Wörterbuch in German, which is even more compendious than the Monier-Williams. And then there are various, there's a list compiled in the 1960s of all the words found in inscriptions from early historical India that has some other names, and there are many names that come from the literature, the Vedic literature that don't necessarily make it into all the dictionaries, and on and on and on. So it's a vast, unless you had the ability to literally commit to memory every one of those words and every one of the compounds formed from those words, and then be able to manipulate them at will in like a supercomputer-like mind, you wouldn't be able to make much progress with this, because given the nature of the evidence, the brevity of the inscriptions, we're left with the only possible way we can compare and contrast and check our results is by this method that I've developed. Let's see, is this the last slide? Yeah, this will be continued in the next, because this is pretty complicated and I want to do it in digestible sizes. So we're going to stop here with this lecture, but suffice it to say that the method that we're going to show yielded eventually, after much trial and error, a lot of spectacular results. And I call it cross-checking. And it simply involves plugging values in. I'll show you how it's done in the next lecture, but you need to have a substring searchable database of the language in question. And as it turned out, there are several such online for Sanskrit, or have been available, and that's what I used. But more of this in the next lecture, which is lecture 7.